Hi, welcome to Real People. I'm Stephanie Allensworth. Today we're kicking off a three-part mini-series on propaganda. And today with me is Michael Shan. He's a historian and he's going to share some great information for us. So welcome to the show, Michael. I'm so glad to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Stephanie.
Yeah. So we did a little talking and we've been going back and forth a little bit about things that we wanted to talk about. But I think we're going to start with the history of how it became so easy for people to fall into the trap of propaganda and how they can be so easily manipulated. Is that where you want to start, or do you want to start somewhere else?
Yeah, that's a good starting point.
Right. It's all
Can I,
yours.
can I start with a story that illustrates the point pretty well?
Mhm.
A friend of mine was in the Vietnam War, and he told me a story about when he came back from Vietnam. People were saying, "We heard that they just made this offensive, and you're making all this progress, and that's so fantastic." And he said, "No, that's not what's happening over there." And they said, "No, no, it is, it is. I saw it on television." And he said, "I was just there. I just came back from the war, and I'm telling you, that's not what's happening over there." And they continue to argue with it. And so there's this phenomenon about television. It gives us a window into the world, but most of us don't realize that that is a heavily sanitized, curated view of the world. And people are so certain of what they know because they've seen it on television or they've read it in the newspaper that even when you get it firsthand from someone who actually knows, it's hard for them to believe.
Exactly.
A similar example might be if you think you know what's happening in the world and a cousin of yours happens to work with the CIA. And he says to you, that's not how it's happening over there. And they go, yeah, it is. And he goes, I know, we have inside information. I have different information than you. That's not how it's happening. So we do get accounts from insiders. We have whistleblowers. We have people that tell us how things are actually operating. And the reality that the masses, the public are exposed to can be very different than what's actually going on in the higher circles and behind the scenes.
Oh, exactly. I mean, we shut out what the professionals and the people that know say because no, the television told us, or the radio told us, or my next door neighbor told me. So they're willing to believe anybody else but the truth teller. It's kind of a
Yeah. Another another simple example of that, I have a friend who was an engineer with Amtrak, not a good friend, but a person I know. And the fellow engineer, they have two engineers when they run the trains, and the other person was scared to death of COVID, and he was concerned he was going to die. And she said, actually, the chances are extremely low for someone in our age bracket, good health. Here's the CDC website, and it shows that you've got a 99.7% chance of survival for our age group. And he said, no, 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 I don't believe that. She goes, this is the CDC website. She pulls up her phone and shows him the site, shows him the data, shows him the statistics, but none of that matched or coincided with the feeling impression he'd been given from the television. Because the television has such a powerful effect. It affects our emotions, it affects how we feel about situations, and it just magnifies it larger than life. I mean, when they asked people in the early stages of COVID how many people they thought would die as a result of COVID, people were saying 3%, 5%, 10% of the population, and wasn't even remotely close to that. In the end, it was, I think, 0.01 or 0.5% or something. It was extremely low.
even sure it was that many.
But again, that's the difference between the actual information, what the CDC says, and then the way we take it in through the media, because the media embellishes.
Oh yeah. And then there's the grapevine, on social media, somebody says something and it almost becomes shameful to believe, oh, I should be ashamed of myself for believing something that I got from a reliable source. Instead, I'm going to believe you who, just heard it from somebody else or, on the old telephone game.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Get that.
So, so I think the subject to start with is the idea of social engineering.
Okay.
So propaganda is, the media itself and how it appeals to us. Social engineering is the larger goal. It's about engineering the masses, engineering social behaviors, guiding social behaviors so that people act and behave in a certain way. And elites have done this for millennia. It was very common that, when a king needed to manage the public, he would have a parade or give them bread and circuses or something like that. It's easy to pacify the public or do something for them so that you could then do whatever you wanted. And this idea of elites, we think now that our elites are our politicians. No, it's the people who choose the politicians. It's the donors. It's the people behind the scenes. It's the deep state. It's those operators. And so these elites, they openly, well, openly, they don't put it in the newspaper, but in their own meetings and in their own statements, they let it be known that they believe that they should be guiding the world. So a perfect example of that is Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum, or David Rockefeller when he was the founder of the Trilateral Commission. We're talking about people who are self-appointed rulers because they feel that they are more fit to rule. Now, this idea of being more fit to rule, it was outlined very clearly in a book called Propaganda. This was a book in 1928. It was by Edward Bernays, Bernays. Bernays was a nephew to Sigmund Freud, and he purchased some of his uncle's manuscripts that talked about the deeper drives within the unconscious, the need for approval, wanting to be part of the group, all these different insecurities, any of these types of things. Now, Bernays largely used this in industry, and he sold it to corporations so they would know how to market their products better. They could appeal to people based on their own insecurities, and this product would fill that void for them, something like that. But in this book in 1928, he openly talked about the idea that certain people are more fit to rule, and it is like a shepherd and his flock. It would be irresponsible for him to just let his flock wander around, and you need to do that with democracy. The shepherds, or the elites, as they would call themselves, it's their duty to guide the masses so that they don't just develop their own ideas and wander off down any path. Mm. They openly talked about these ideas, and we have many other quotes as well. So go ahead.
I've seen many clips coming from some of these forums and talks with Schwab and Rockefeller that, the Rothschilds, etc., that are kind of exposing what they actually say behind closed doors. So you're spot on. That's what they're talking about.
So sometimes the new expression we use, sometimes they say the quiet part out loud. Exactly. They don't, it's supposed to be the unspoken thing. But when we look at how some of these people are leading, Justin Trudeau in Canada or Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, terribly unpopular leaders, but they had the backing of the UN or the WHO, and they were probably told, hey, follow this course and you'll be protected. There was a massive resistance in New Zealand and in Canada with the truckers' strike and all these different things. And they were quick to just call all those people domestic terrorists or, white supremacists or whatever it is. They labeled them in some way to marginalize them. But a lot of these leaders, they're following somebody else's orders. And that is how this is working.
That teaches them. I mean, these are all the hand-selected people by the elites, correct?
Yes, under the World Economic Forum and under Klaus Schwab's tutelage, it was called the Global Young Leaders Program. And so probably 20 of the leaders we see today were kind of groomed for these positions 20 or more years ago. So Justin Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel, Jacinda Ardern. We could keep on naming them. And a lot of them, again, they were seen to have certain potential, but then they were indoctrinated into a certain way of thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I may, there's a very good book on this issue of Bernays and his idea that elites should rule, or at least quietly, behind the scenes, make the decisions and administer over the masses. Mm-hmm. There's a great documentary called The Century of the Self.
The Century of what?
The Century of the Self, S-E-L-F, like yourself. And this was a 4-part BBC documentary series by Adam Curtis. Mm. And it showed how Bernays got people from being oriented towards being of service and doing something for your government to finally being drawn into your own world and the fulfillment of your own needs and your own satisfaction and your own happiness. So instead of putting yourself out there to be of service, like if you think about what happened in the 30s and some of the big infrastructure projects, I'm still amazed at the roads and the bridges and the dams and some of the fantastic infrastructure projects that have been done by our grandparents and great grandparents. And that's not the mindset we see in our current generation.
Mm.
So again, it's so much about self-fulfillment. So in the century of the South, they give the history of Bernays and his involvement. And then what happened was after the Great Depression, people started to ask questions. What happened? How did this happen? And so the citizens started to get involved in government. And the elites didn't really want that. They don't want true democracy where the people are making the decisions for themselves. They wanted to guide things in a particular way. So they had to figure out another way to distract people.
Yeah, we don't want
And
any figures around here, right?
right. And again, this goes back to a quote by, I believe it was Kissinger, where he said, uh, "Some issues are too important to be left up to the masses."
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
know, and there's kind of a spin-off on that is the democracy is too important to be left up to the people. That
Mhm.
wasn't Kissinger, but you can find that one online pretty easily.
Yeah. So you're so far so good. Let's keep going.
So to give people an idea of how this is done, um, there was a great article in 1977. It was by Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein. And the article, you can find it online very easily. It's called The CIA and the Media. And in that article, they explained that the CIA had over 400 journalists who had worked for the CIA or do work for the CIA. That was common practice. There was another quote by William Colby, who was a CIA director, I believe in the 80s. I'm not exactly sure from when till when. And the quote was, "The CIA owns everyone of any significance in the major media."
Mhm.
That quote was taken from a book titled Derailing Democracy.
Yeah.
So the media we get is heavily curated, and they guide us in how we should think about certain things.
Yeah.
And so there are some of us who, at a certain point, we start asking questions. And of course, conspiracy theorist is a term that's thrown out. That I think you may know the history of that term. It really was heavily used after the JFK assassination.
By the CIA.
Say that again?
The CIA created that.
Yes, exactly. And it was to delegitimize and marginalize anybody that presented something other than the official story. And
Right.
then it was very easy for people following the official story to like just dismiss it. Oh, that person's crazy. I don't have to listen to him. Not only are you not having to face uncomfortable truths by taking that position and calling your friend a conspiracy theorist, but the second thing is you actually get to feel a little better about yourself because you're the intelligent one and he's the crazy. Rather than he's the one that's courageous enough to look for some truth and you're not. You'd think you might actually, if you admitted that you'd like to keep your head in the sand, you'd think you might be a little embarrassed about it. But by using this term, people can actually walk away feeling pretty good about themselves.
Mhm.
So psychologically, it has quite an effect as well.
Yeah, and I think most of them just believed it anyway because I, I I'll just take it from myself. Before I started really doing my own research, I used to be a believer. Like I believed what the government told me because that seemed like I couldn't believe that they could lie to us. Let me put it that way, or to shall we say, or use propaganda against us. And so that's why I want to do this with you and kind of peel back the onion, if you will, layer by layer and find out. I think you talked about Plato at one time and how it's kind of this propaganda has evolved over the centuries. Do we want to go back that far or just keep driving forward from here with the?
I'll touch on that briefly, but I'll kind of continue on where I was. In Plato's The Republic, I think he talked about the idea of either priest kings or philosopher kings. And again, even there, it was the idea that some people are just a little more fit to rule. Now, I actually agree with that. I see that some people, they have more of an aptitude. They may be more altruistic in their thinking or their outlook. They look at the world a little bit more. I do think some people are wired a little differently, or that's their worldview. However, I don't think that justifies deception. And
Exactly.
that's the issue. If you might be a little more fit to rule, okay, find a way to get yourself in that position, get elected for office, or or somehow work in those circles until finally you can do what you feel you're supposed to do. But the idea that you know, dumb down or lie to the masses in some way just so they'll go along with whatever your agenda is, well, that's again, it's a slippery slope once you start to do those things.
Yeah, definitely a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Um, okay, well, thank you. Yeah.
So if I may continue, so um, regarding thinking and propaganda, so some of the first great propagandists, and when I say great, renowned propagandists, I don't know if we call them, they were very good at what they did, we probably shouldn't aspire to be like them. So great kind of carries that connotation. There was Edward Bernays and there was Walter Lippmann, two P's, Lippmann, and they wrote some of the first books on propaganda in America. They were the head of the Office of War Information for World War One. And Lippmann, at one point, one of his quotes was, "When all think alike, no one is thinking very much." That's what we see now. We see thinking where all you have to do is say a name, say Russia or say Putin, and everybody thinks, "Oh my God, oh my goodness," and then you'll hear the 5 or 6 or 7 sound bites that they know that they got from the television.
Yeah.
And so we could do that on 10 different issues where we say a word or two and we start to hear these same talking points from people. So the fact that everyone is thinking alike on these issues shows that they're not really looking for the other side. They're not doing their own research. And my contention is that in order to really understand reality, how things are actually happening in the world, how power actually works, the truth of certain situations, you can't just take in information passively. It's not enough to just read the newspaper or watch television. You need to seek out information. You need to seek out other perspectives. You have to make the effort to listen to someone that you might feel you disagree with. If you think Putin is such a bad guy, watch the interview between Tucker and Putin, Tucker Carlson and Putin, for example. Really listen to Putin and say, does this person sound crazy? And try and give it a fair chance. Listen to that other side. Some people act like, you know, someone like him. He's so poisonous. He's so conniving that if you even listen to him, it's going to get into your brain like a virus, and then it's going to affect you forever, and you're not going to be able. You're going to be under his spell now. I mean, people really act like you can't even listen to the other side because it's going to contaminate you in some. I can listen to someone who has some bad ideas or a person who may be wrong, and we can discriminate. We can discern and decide what's accurate, what's not.
Yeah.
And so that's where trying to pull the emotions out of it and being a little more objective, that's the only way we're really going to find the truth on a lot of these things, because so many people have strong emotional responses before they even look at the information.
Exactly.
Just won't listen. Like if I tell them that Gaddafi was actually loved by his people in Libya, he had a 98% approval rating. Life was really good. They had one of the best lifestyles and incomes in all of North Africa. They had no debt and lots of water, and they were funding their own infrastructure projects. There was almost no homelessness, no unemployment. Things were really, really good. He was loved.
Mm-hmm.
Yet people, but you say the name Gaddafi and people have an emotional response and they think they know. And this is how propaganda works. When you hear things 10, 15, 20 times, Gaddafi's bad, Gaddafi's bad, Gaddafi's like Hitler, all these types of things, people can't even be rational and objective. And that's part of just finding the truth is you need to set your emotions aside and at least entertain the possibility that you didn't get entirely accurate information.
Well, and there's a book I want to bring up, The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And that was a real eye opener for me regarding these other countries that we thought were doing all these horrible things. And we have to go save the people from their own government, which in case of Gaddafi was wrong, completely wrong, and it was completely false. So it's a really good book. What is his name again?
John Perkins.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, and that's a great example because again, here's an insider telling a story that none of us heard. We didn't know that was how power operated. We didn't know that's how technically he wasn't in the government because the government needed plausible deniability. So he's in a quasi-governmental organization, but he was trained by CIA in character profiling and trying to find character profiling is essentially trying to figure out what makes a person tick and find their weaknesses. Find how can you put the hooks in that particular person? What drives him, and can we give him more of that?
Yeah.
So, and that's an insider's view of how power works. And we need to be taking in those books. And as you do, you start to put the pieces together and you start to put together a proper world. And the reason I have gotten into this field is because it's far more interesting. It's not that I'm looking for convenient answers to all the world's problems. It's that it's far more interesting than the sanitized history we're given.
Oh,
When
yeah.
you realize how things have actually happened, the wars and different events and things like that, and who the different players were.
Yes.
So finding the truth is actually a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, there a lot of discernment comes along with that, though, because as we talked about before, there's a lot of propaganda that gets inserted that we're not aware of. So you have to be very careful and use discernment. And even when you do use discernment, even myself, sometimes I've been led astray when I thought I was getting smarter than that, getting on to their tricks. So, um, and discernment's huge.
Absolutely. So one point worth noting, in the Obama administration, he had a technology czar called Cass Sunstein. And Cass Sunstein endorsed an idea called cognitive infiltration. And what he argued was that we've got these people out there, these conspiracy theorists who think the government's doing all this stuff. And we don't want them to get a foothold and convert more people to their way of thinking. So we need to run a disinformation campaign where we're going to put bad information out into their networks, bad theories, bad ideas, things that are easily proven to be false. And when they latch onto that information and start repeating it, we can then easily disprove those theories and ideas and delegitimize them at the same time, making them look like they're naive or gullible or that they'll believe just anything. Now, the irony in this program was that the people who were finding the truth, suppose their great sin was that they believed the government was doing something bad and maybe the government shouldn't be trusted. The government's response with this program is to do that very thing, to undermine them and to do something where they shouldn't be trusted.
Mhm. Yeah.
So the government ends up doing the very thing the group accused them of doing. And again, that's how government operates a lot of times.
Talk about a slippery slope, right?
Absolutely.
That one snowballed.
There was a great quote that came out in this last, or maybe not quote, but a meme we've heard several times over the last few years. And the meme is, they know they're lying. We know they're lying. They know that we know that they're lying, and they're still lying.
Yeah.
So when 5 or 10% of the population wakes up a little bit and realizes that they're lying, that doesn't concern them because they know they still have 90 to 95% of the population on their side. So they'll continue to act as if no one ever pointed out the lie that they're wrong about a particular thing. They just keep on repeating their point. And for those of us who found the truth, we're like, how can they continue to lie like that? And it's because they have no shame. And in fact, shame would make it very hard for them to do what they do. When you know that a group in the corner, you were speaking to a large group of people, and a group in the corner knows absolutely that you're lying, and you know that they know, and for you to still continue to lie, that takes a certain type of individual.
Yeah. Well, it's actually for me, not only is it lying, it's projection. So they're flipping it. So they are doing the very thing that they accuse you of doing. They're doing what they accuse you of doing. And this has been getting to be like a very strange game. It's like, what? No. So I mean, how do we circumvent that sort of thing? And like, God,
That is oftentimes what happens when you're dealing with, at least on an individual basis, dealing with people. A very dominant personality, a narcissist, a psychopath, they lack self-reflection, and they're so firm in their beliefs about their world that they'll try and overpower you until you accept their version of reality as well. And this can happen in a relationship where it might not be a physically abusive relationship, but a psychologically abusive relationship where a woman starts to feel that, and I'm saying woman, it could be a man too, but a woman might start to feel like she's the problem, she's wrong, she's the reason that he's getting violent, or she's the reason that he's losing his temper or whatever else. And so you start to doubt your own reality. And it's the ultimate type of gaslighting, where you're trying to convince people that they're crazy and they can't trust their reality, that they need to accept your reality.
Yeah,
And so a very dominant personality, certain people have that ability to kind of pull people into their way of viewing.
yeah,
And so we see that a lot where, when you see 10 different people say this is how it is, they've all bought into a certain version of reality. And that takes on a kind of gravity of its own, where it draws people into it, and you almost get drawn into it. And you certainly, it's not always easy to stand your own ground because that seems, again, even if I turn on the television and I watch it for a period of time, it's very convincing the way they do this. A lot of this is very scientifically developed.
yeah. They call it the Mockingbird media for a reason because everybody gets the same script. You have to say the lie the same way on every station because these people tend to own every station. So you, almost verbatim with just a little bit of different inflection in between.
We have some great compilations now. That's one of the nice things about the internet. You'll hear a phrase every once in a while, and you see ABC, CBS, NBC, all the pundits, all the other news stations, and even little regional news stations in Tallahassee, Florida, or Indianapolis or something. And these news people are using the exact same expression. With Biden, sharp as a tack. He was sharp as a tack, sharp as a tack. And we have compilations of 40 different people using that exact phrase.
Yeah.
Or there's another compilation. This is unsafe for our democracy. No,
Oh,
this is dangerous. This is very dangerous to our democracy.
yeah.
And you have all these people saying it. They are given talking points and they repeat it. Now, your audience hearing that from me doesn't carry near as much weight as when I show that to people. When I show that compilation to somebody and they see it, you watch this process happening in their eyes, and they're just taking it in, and they're just dumbfounded. They're like, how can this be? Is this really how the media operates? But they have to see it for themselves. So I can, after this talk, I'll provide you a couple of links, and when you post the talk, put the links down at the bottom, and we can give people a couple examples of those.
If we cut it in spots here, if I have the original file that I can download,
Yeah, we could do that too.
then I can add it. I can cut it right in so we can show it as we say it.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Well, if I may, so let me get back to kind of where I was going. Um, I started to do at a certain point, studying so many different things. I mean, like I wanted to give some examples of things, looking back from, let's say, Revolutionary War times to the present day. So it's about 250 years. Um, I went down through history and thought of all the different things where what really happened in those different historical uh, episodes, we got a very different version than the reality. And me just brainstorming last night, I came up with a list of uh, basically, I've got 120 different events.
Oh boy.
And I'm sure if I gave it a little more time, I could come up with 200. So the real causes of the Revolutionary War, the story of the first Bank of the United States, the funding mechanism, the War of 1812, what Andrew Jackson tried to do with his fight against the banks, the real causes of the Civil War. I mean, just an example, the real causes of the Civil War. Everybody thinks it was slavery. Actually, slavery was not the primary cause of the Civil War. It was used later on as a recruitment and as kind of an emotional appeal for why they stood up. But Lincoln said it was to keep the nation together. And the nation was on the verge of fracturing. And you had German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who explained that very thing. He gave an admission, and he said the high financial powers of Europe were behind the U.S. Civil War. They orchestrated it to happen years before. And it was basically the banks. The banks wanted to split America and profit. And at one point in the Civil War, Lincoln needed loans from the New York banks. And when he went to get these loans, he walked away hat in hand and very discouraged because the bankers said that they were going to offer him a 36% interest rate.
Oh, yeah.
Which is why he then printed the greenbacks, because he could just print the money. He didn't have to borrow it from the bankers. But once he started doing that, that was all the more reason the bankers had to get rid of it. So this history, there are so many of these pieces of history. You don't have to hear it all from me. There's a very good documentary at least a good foundation for people. And I tell people that understanding the banking system is an important starting point. So there was a documentary called The Money Masters.
Mm.
You can find it on YouTube. Just use that exact title, The Money Masters. It's about 3.5 hours. So you'll probably want to break it up. I didn't find any factual inaccuracies anywhere in that documentary.
Mm.
And it gives the history of banking, the influence of banking, how they have been close to kings and monarchs and world leaders for years. They're the ones that bring wars about. They're oftentimes the instigator of a war. War of 1812. Most people don't really know what the War of 1812 was about. It was about the renewal of the bank charter of the First Bank of the United States. The U.S. did not want to renew the charter. And so Nathan Rothschild basically asked the British Crown, we need to do something about these, arrogant Americans.
Yeah.
It was to force their hand on the renewing of the bank charter.
Mm.
Now, why does Nathan Rothschild and the Bank of England have anything to do with the U.S. banking system? Because the first Bank of the United States, when you looked at the owners, it was mostly Europeans. So the Americans realized that they didn't even have control over their own money supply. It was European bankers that exerted pressure over America.
Was that before or after 1871, I think it was, when the Corporation of the United States was created, the PC?
Yeah, what I'm talking about is the very first 1792. So right after the Constitution was signed and ratified, and the nation was starting to operate, they knew that they needed a banking system. They didn't exactly know how to do it, and they trusted some others, and they thought, okay, we'll do it this way. And they didn't realize that rather than printing their own money, which they were authorized to do by the Constitution, they were borrowing at interest.
Mm.
So the first Bank of the United States had a charter from 1792 to 1812,
1812, okay.
20-year charter.
Yeah.
And then after the War of 1812, they did get their charter renewed. And so then the second renewal came up during Andrew Jackson's presidency. And that's why Andrew Jackson was fighting the banks so hard, because he did not want to renew their charter.
Mm.
And the banks exerted huge influence over American politics.
Oh, yeah. They still do.
Not just politics, just America in general, commerce, everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that documentary, The Money Masters, highly recommended. And they give pieces of history. Again, Civil War, quotes from insiders, quotes from politicians, quotes about the Great Depression. You have a number of people. You have Milton Friedman, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist that most people know that name. He said that it was clear that the Great Depression was caused by the bankers.
Mm.
They restricted all the money. They pulled money out of supply. And so when there's no liquidity, even though you may have commerce and production and everything else, if there's no liquidity, how do people even exchange things?
Yeah.
So, and it wasn't just him, it was Charles Lindbergh, who was, I believe, a senator, no, congressman, I think. Lewis McFadden, he was the head of the House Banking and Currency Committee. So you had insiders in Congress that had an up close look at what was happening, and they did say that the Great Depression was caused. It didn't have to happen that way.
Yeah.
But the Black Tuesday, I think it was Black Tuesday, the initial crash was just the cover for bank policy that then was put in place over a period of 3 to 4 years in which they restricted all the money and pulled the money out of the economy. That crash was not the thing that brought the economy down. It was a shift in banking policy.
The shift in what?
Banking policy.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I guess.
Specifically Fed policy.
Yeah. Follow the money. Always follow the money, because I think we're going to be surprised. A lot of people will be surprised to see how much influence the money makers and the money masters have had over our entire, what, 2 or 3 centuries?
It goes all the way back. I mean, the interesting thing about money, one of the great books on the subject, it's not a well-known book, it's called The Lost History of Biblical Debt Cancellations. It was by classical economist Michael Hudson. And he traced banking all the way back to Sumeria. And the kings of Sumeria, when they came into power, they would always wipe out all debts. A new king would come in, wipe out all debts. And they knew that it would usher in prosperity because everybody was happy, debt-free. They would be optimistic about their, what they could do and everything else. And they found that as time went on and you didn't wipe out debts, what would happen was a type of depression or discouragement would set in. People would turn a little bit more to alcohol and intoxicants and things like this. crime would increase, domestic abuse and issues would rise. Neighbors were at each other a little bit more, it'd be more of a contentious atmosphere. And then eventually a type of a despondency would set in because it was a different time then. It wasn't like now where a person could win the lottery or get an education and really significantly like change your lot in life. Like if a person really sets to it, you can get education and you could pull yourself out of whatever environment you're in and put yourself in a different environment. Back in those times, if your grandfather was a sheep herder and your father was a sheep herder, there's a pretty good chance that you know what you're going to be doing later on in life. There weren't that many different opportunities. Um, so in those times, when you had a debt, you kind of knew what things were going to be looking like, and you knew that that debt was going to hang over you like a yoke that was just going to pull you down. And the interesting thing is, all the things we see today are the result. So many of the social problems we see today are the results of debt compounding over time. And the Sumerians knew way back then, they were fantastic with mathematics and tables and understanding growth of numbers and interest and everything else. They knew that when debt was allowed to compound, and if you didn't write it down or wipe out the debts from time to time, it would destroy society. So when we look at the Bible talks about Jubilee. Well, Jubilee is the idea that from time to time you wipe out debts. And when you do that, when we use the word jubilee or jubilant, it means that people are ecstatic, they're happy, they're joyous. It's something to celebrate. And that's because it just takes so much of the stress out of people and out of society. And so I would argue that, the issue of usury, rather than God coming down from the heavens and saying no usury, I also think that it's just a sound rule for a functioning society. Much like if you look at the Ten Commandments, you know, honoring your parents, not coveting your neighbor's wife, being honest, not stealing. You know, I don't even think about these as specifically moral things as much as these are just sound principles for a healthy, functioning society where there's mutual respect all the way around. And so with the Jubilee and the issue of usury, they know it destroys societies. So why in the world would you allow
it. Mm. Yeah, I'd like a jubilee for sure right now. Let's do it.
it? Again, I do understand the flip side of it. I mean, there are a lot of people who they need that 3 or 5% interest because people that have a retirement account, they're counting on that interest so that their account will grow a little bit and everything else. So I understand that the interest mechanism doesn't seem all bad, but you also need to be able to write down debts somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
And so Greece, when Greece was doing their debt restructuring years ago, their finance minister, his name is Yanis Varoufakis, brilliant man. I think he was trained at Oxford. He might even still be a university, or he was a university professor at one time. And he pulled together 10 or 20 other economists, and they figured out a financial plan, a restructuring plan that they could make it work. They could pay off their debt, but they knew how much had coming in. They knew how much they could adjust social programs and expenditures, outlays, things like that. And when they really got down to it, they say we need to be able to write the debt down by 15 or 20%. If you just write it down a little, from then we can pay it back. And the bankers would not write it down at all, not even 2%. Mm. And they said it's going to destroy us as a country. We can't. It's an unpayable debt. Unpayable means it's just impossible. Yeah. But if you write it down 80%, it's payable. We can give us time and we can do it. They wouldn't write it at all.
That's where the term debt.
They're willing to destroy countries or break up countries and have them sell their sovereign assets, their bridges, their infrastructures, their ports, their great ruins and things like that. They're willing to force them to privatize those things and essentially destroy a country and its culture rather than just write the debt down 10 or 20%.
Yeah, but there's another thing behind all that too, which is they deliberately put them into debt to keep them that way, like this debt slavery program. And I guess I'm kind of talking out of turn, but
no, you're absolutely right. This goes back to Confessions of an Economic Hitman. These things are done deliberately. Yeah. And that was what John Perkins talked about. You get a country to take on big loans from the IMF, the World Bank, in Greece's case, the ECB, European Central Bank, and you know that they're not going to be able to pay back the loans. And so there you have them in a bad position.
And
And we know this is a recipe for the destruction of sovereign countries.
And well, they go in, and say we're going to start a war now because we're going to save the people from their ruler that was so bad, and through what propaganda? They do this whole propaganda campaign against them, like they did Gaddafi, and say, oh, he's bad, he's murdering, he's doing this, he's doing that. It's horrible for horrible for them, but not for his people, right? And so they couldn't get him to budge. So they started the propaganda. They came in, started the war, both sides, and then said, okay, now we're going to come in. We're going to be heroes. We're going to place our guy in there that will work with us, and uh, and now we're going to rebuild for you. But we'll give you these loans, but the loans actually don't go to the people. It goes to the companies that come in and do the rebuilding. So therefore, they're still stuck with the same debt, and they're paying for the infrastructure that they were supposed to get with this loan, but it's never been their money. It's a very, very nefarious way of operating, and I wish everybody could have the windows open on this so they could see what's really going on behind the curtain. It's
It's such a cynical, callous way of operating that most people just can't wrap their mind around it. They can't believe that people could have so little concern for others.
oh yeah.
And this is again why propaganda works. We'll bring it back to propaganda here. Most people can't lie like that, wouldn't deceive people like that because they personally, they would never do it. And it's hard for them to imagine that someone else would be so unfeeling, so callous that they would do that.
Yeah.
So that idea that you're being deceived on such a big scale, that's really hard for people.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I may, let me bring it back to an example. In studying so many different things over the years, I would have conversations with people and I would present information and they say, oh, I don't believe that. And I say, well, no, go to this book, listen to this speech. Here's a name of a whistleblower. Here's something that's on the congressional record. I mean, I could present them the facts and reliable information. They still just wouldn't believe it. And so rather than presenting all the details, what I started to do at one point, I said to someone, I said, okay, let's go with a hypothetical scenario. Let's say that I could provide you irrefutable evidence that your view on X, whatever X may be. Um, let's say causes of the second Iraq War. If I could in 2003, that Iraq War. If I could prove that if I had irrefutable evidence that your understanding of that is completely wrong, would you look at it? And the first response of most people is, well, you don't have evidence like that. And I said, well, this is just a hypothetical scenario here. You can't change my hypothetical scenario for another one and refute that one. Go with my hypothetical scenario. If I had irrefutable evidence, would you look at it? And because I haven't actually presented the information yet, and I think they're concerned that if they say yes, that I would look at it, they think they're then going to have to look at the information because I'm going to give it to them and they're going to be stuck in this bad spot. So a lot of them really think hard about it. And then they look at me and they say, no, I don't think I would. And I said, irrefutable evidence. It's the truth on the matter. You wouldn't look at it. Okay, why do you think that is? And because, again, I haven't presented all the information, I'm not trying to convince them. It's just kind of a hypothetical thought experiment. They lay out their whole belief system. They say, I don't want to believe that the government could be that evil. I don't want to believe that the government is lying to us. I don't want to believe that a media is part of all those lies. I don't want to believe that we're all being fooled. I don't want to believe that there's that kind of evil in the world. I don't want to believe that I can't trust anything or anybody anymore. And they lay out their whole belief system, and you realize at that point that it's really hard for people to take in information that completely upsets their worldview.
Oh yeah, shattered illusions. That's what I call it. You get
It's
illusions shattered because, but you know what it does, Michael? It plants a seed. If you can plant a seed, like somebody did for me when I started asking questions, but I did the due diligence. I went out and started looking things up and watching these documentaries and things like Out of Shadows and Europa. Gosh, what is it? Europa, the oh, jeez, I can't remember the whole title of it now. But anyway, I mean, some of the stuff's hard to watch. You can't unsee some things, but sometimes you have to look behind that curtain, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Certain truths can be uncomfortable, but ultimately you're going to be better equipped to understand things, make good decisions for your family, for your loved ones, prepare in a way because you can see what's coming financially or otherwise. With better information, you're going to be able to make better decisions. So it's good to know these things. And to your point, it's a very good point. Um, the most we can do is plant a seed. Even when you have all the facts on a particular situation, and you could debate it up and down, and you just that doesn't mean you're going to change anybody's mind. I imagine your audience, because they're listening to you, I imagine that they've got some experience in finding the truth, and a lot of us have figured out the truth on a particular issue, and we might have talked ourselves blue in the face to somebody else, trying to present this point and this point and this point, and it barely fazed the person.
Well, to
And
before, kind of earlier on in our conversation, you can't have that conversation with most people because they will just start screaming in your face. And so you have to walk away and just say, okay, this is like a no-go zone. We can't have this conversation. If
depends on how emotional they are about the issue. If it's, for example, Trump in today's era, yeah, people will scream. People are so almost hysterical
you
about that issue. They're not able to be rational. And there are other issues, Russia and Putin, they might be so aggressive about that kind of issue. But there are other issues where it's not even that they'll scream. Sometimes you're sharing information with a person and you can just see their eyes kind of glass over. Their eyes get a little glossy and you realize that they're not really following you.
yeah.
And that's because the best we can do. I haven't had a conversation where, I presented 5 points to the person and they just changed their mind about it. That just doesn't ever happen. They may, if they were curious and they say, I'd like to understand this particular thing, then you can present information and that works. They'll take it in because they were looking for the information already. But, and you have to remember, most people are going about their day, they're in their routine. You see somebody in a coffee shop, they're not ready to change their mind about a really consequential issue, hearing it from you in a coffee shop on a Tuesday.
Yeah.
Usually, if we go to university and we study, or if we go to a lecture because there's some presenter there, some of it has to do with the environment. You need to be in the right environment to even share information. So if a person sits down to watch something like this, okay, that is kind of this agreement, a tacit agreement that, okay, someone's going to share information with me and I'm going to take in information. But if you're just meeting your friend in town and then you're going to basically tell them something, we can't expect that they're going to listen to us and change their mind. And some of it just has to do with they don't have the bandwidth for it in that moment. They've got other things on their mind and it's not the right environment.
Yeah.
So we can plant seeds. And some of those seeds, sometimes it takes 10 years for it to sprout, and sometimes it's just a month or two. It just creates enough curiosity in the person that they start looking on their own. But if there is some kind of a waking process or a looking for truth or a curiosity, it comes from within that individual, and that's out of our control.
Yeah, I totally understand that. And I don't want to blow up anybody's reality. I mean, if they're comfortable in their reality and they don't want to be affected by what's going on around them, usually that happens right up until the moment where it does affect them. And then the big change happens. And it's like wait a minute moment. This is now personally affecting me. And kind of like what happened with our economy here with this last administration, it's like the economy really made people wake up and go, wait a minute, what's going on here? And some of these harebrained ideas that were being put forward, hopefully they've got the brakes put on now, with, like, for instance, finding a way to tax unmonetized gains or unrealized gains, I mean. So it's like, wait a minute, what? Oh, no, you don't. You're not going to charge me for the equity in my house that I haven't cashed in on. I mean, how
Right.
talk to me like that? It's like, it's insane. But but that's when I think you get the moment where people want to say, well, maybe there is something to this. Maybe there is something going on that I'm not aware of. Maybe I shouldn't believe everything on certain channels, you know?
And this is a really exciting time in that way. Again, COVID was a big part of that. When people started to find out some truth about the actual numbers of COVID, the government's over the top response, shutting down businesses, forcing people to stay home. I mean, having real psychologically detrimental effects on children, on families, on people. Alcoholism and drug abuse increased, depression and suicide increased. I mean, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. predicted that early on. He said the actual societal costs are going to be so huge. And it wasn't just him. There was a group called, they called themselves, it was the Great Barrington Group. And it was headed by three academics. And they formed what was called the Great Barrington Declaration. And they had about 25 signatories, nearly all of them university professors or academics. And they said, when you look at all the costs of lockdown, you're going to do far more damage with the lockdown than the disease will ever do. You protect the weak, you protect the elderly, you protect the immunocompromised, and you let the rest of society operate, and the rest of society will eventually develop a herd immunity, and then that herd immunity will benefit everybody else. And I don't need to get into all the details of COVID, but again, so some of these measures are so extreme that it started to wake people up.
But it wasn't
It's
that propaganda, Michael. I mean, the propaganda was no, herd immunity is not going to work in this instance. You know, oh, this is a smarter virus than that. You know, and so propaganda, and it got into people's heads. You're not, you know, you're going to kill grandma if you go see her. You know, it's like, oh boy. Well,
it did get into some people's heads, and we had people, I call them true believers, who, completely believed everything the government said, followed every edict the government made, every mandate, every injunction. But then there were a lot of people who were personally affected negatively, like the person who, their parent was in a nursing home and they couldn't even visit them.
oh yeah.
And their parent might not have been fully cognitively, understanding of what's happening and why are my loved ones not coming to see me. They might, because some people have a little bit of dementia or something they didn't understand.
Yeah,
So we called them deaths of despair.
exactly.
It was heartbreaking. And so if you're a person in that situation, people started to ask questions. Why is this so extreme? Why are they doing this? Why are they pushing this? And then, of course, on the issue of bodily autonomy, saying that you don't even have, it used to be my body, my choice, but not with the shots.
Right.
And so all of a sudden, even people who they might have even planned on getting the shot, but the fact that the government says you absolutely have to, you don't have a choice. There's a mandate here. And again, the government was able to enforce the mandate, but if your employer might have, if you're a government employee or something like that, all those little things, when you add them all up over those few years, it started to wake people up. And so there's a really interesting process afoot right now where people are just opening their eyes a little more, and we're able to have conversations about historical events and what governments do, how they operate, how they lie. And people who before, were maybe on the fence or didn't believe some of that, they're just a little more open and they're looking now. And again, when you push too hard, too fast with your propaganda, with your agendas, it does wake people up.
Yeah.
And so, and then oftentimes what the government does in response, they'll increase their propaganda even more. They'll gaslight even more, convincing you you're crazy. And then the more they do that, well, then again, sometimes it kind of works. It's an intimidation factor, but then it wakes people up even more, and it shows how completely ridiculous some of this is. So, as an example of that, the Nord Stream pipeline. If we look at that one issue, the narrative was that Putin is so crazy, he's such a madman, he's so unhinged that he blew up his own pipeline, his own revenue stream, so that he could blame somebody else for it. And we have all these direct quotes from Ted Cruz, Joe Biden, Victoria Nuland, a number of people in the House and the Senate before the Nord Stream was blown up. They said, we're going to stop the Nord Stream pipeline. We're going to take it down. Somehow we're going to do something about it. The Nord Stream pipeline will be no more. So you had all these people saying that that was their goal, that somehow they were going to do it. Then it happens. And then everybody says, well, who, me? What are you talking about? We wouldn't do that. After they'd said it again and again.
Projection again. It was,
Right.
it had to be the one that did. Well, you know about that? One thing I didn't understand was how long they let that thing gush into the oceans when they could have just cranked it shut, couldn't they? I mean, it's like, why is it still gushing? Days and weeks and like that's
I do think they shut it down because it doesn't make sense that the Russians would allow all that natural gas to continue to dissipate. But from the shut off valve, wherever that was, to that point, and then downstream from there, I assume, I don't know the exact distance, but I assume there's anywhere between, 50 and 100 miles or kilometers of just pipe there where there wasn't a shut off. So any gas that was in that particular section of pipe, I think that was what was coming out.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
And again, I'm not in this talk today. I'm not going to present the evidence we have about Nord Stream, but anybody who just thinks about it, that narrative that Russia did it to itself, it's absurd. Everybody knows it's absurd. Everybody who's thinking, the Europeans know it's not true, the Russians know it's not true, American leadership knows it's not true. We've got good academics and everybody else. But again, these are the types of things the media says, and if you disagree and you try and just say the obvious, they try and hit you over the head, metaphorically speaking.
Or arrest you for telling the truth.
Yeah.
And, a lot of good people, getting punished for.
And and the more they use those tactics, the more it wakes people up. So it's this vicious cycle where when that waking process starts, then what happens is the machine, well, a lot of people are referring to it as Leviathan. Leviathan starts to show itself. We start to really see how it operates. And so we're in this time now where it's easier and easier to see it. And it's just a personal choice for each person. How much of it are you willing to see? And the truth is, it's not scary. It's, yes, you're going to have to adjust your worldview. But again, a lot of us abide by, know the truth, and the truth shall set you free.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So if I can, let me go back to a couple more things where I kind of had an outline of a few things I wanted to cover. One of the things I hear a lot from people is, well, he's an intelligent person or she's an intelligent person. Why doesn't she see this? And they think that there's a connection between intelligence and the ability to see the truth. Now, a lot of people use the word waking up. I try to avoid that now because waking up is so close to woke, and woke is such a stupid term. I mean, if you're calling yourself woke, you're probably not. It's too arrogant of a term. The requirement for any of this is a little humility. You never really get all the way there. Even when you've studied a ton, you're going to run into somebody who has better information than you, a better understanding, an insider perspective. You need to always be willing to adjust your view as more information comes in, and then you can integrate more pieces, and it'll be a clearer picture as you do that. Calling yourself woke makes it sound like you're already there. You arrived. You're there. You're awake now. You see it. So I don't like the term, but when I talk about seeing the truth. So they say, well, he's an intelligent person. Why can't he see this? In my experience, there's not a direct relationship. There's not a correlation between intelligence and one seeing the truth. In fact, if there's any correlation, it's an inverse relationship. It's not inverse because less intelligent people find the truth just because they're gullible or they believe anything. It's rather what I find is an intelligent person, their ego often blocks them from seeing the truth. If you always step into a room and perceive yourself to be the smartest person in the room, why in the world are you going to go listen to two people, Michael and Stephanie, who don't have three PhDs? Why are you going to listen to them as if they have information you don't? You'd say, well, if that information were out there, surely I would have heard of it, or I would have found it, or if it were credible information, someone would have presented it to us. And so there are all these different mechanisms that are going on in the mind of an intelligent person. And so generally, they're not going to take in information from somebody else. They might take it into, if they go to a lecture, again, it comes down to setting. If they go to a lecture and they hear somebody who's at a higher level than them in the academic world, they might listen to that person, but they're not going to listen to someone without all those PhDs at a dinner party or at a school function. They're just not. So I don't, I generally that idea that there's a correlation between intelligence and being awake, I don't find that to be the case. Another thing I found. Um, Hold on, I lost my train of thought for just a second. I've been talking too much. Please go for a second.
Now you know how I'm ADD, so I tend to take us out on tangents. Okay, so
Okay. Okay.
I'll go
Um,
through that.
go
So
ahead. So what the second thing I was going to say is, okay, so why is it that some people see the truth and other people, they're just not wired that way? They just don't. There may be many reasons, but there are two for sure that seem to be the theme. And I think of everybody I know who's on this path, either it's someone who is naturally rebellious, you question things, you were probably that way when you were young, you questioned authority, you wanted answers, you wanted to understand why is it this way, and you continued that way. And if you found something, you weren't so concerned about what other people thought. You were confident enough in yourself that if someone laughed at you or mocked you or whatever else, that wasn't going to cause you to change. So people that have that makeup, they're well suited to find the truth. Because there are a lot of people, I think it was Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s daughter-in-law, Amaryllis. I believe it was her in a talk. I could be wrong about that. She was in an interview recently with Robert F. Kennedy and Robert Epstein. And she was saying that in the CIA, they were testing people taking in new information. And rather than it going to the area of discernment and critical thinking in the mind, there's another part of the brain that lights up first when you're taking up different information. And that is, what will others think of me? How will I be perceived by the people that I know if I believe this thing?
mhm.
Now, I don't know what you call that part of the brain or whatever, but they knew enough about the brain and the different kind of the way we process information. That's oftentimes the first thing, the first place we go when we're taking in this information. Is this acceptable for me to take this in, or is it gonna wreck my world somehow?
Hmm. Wow. I can relate with that, but I can also relate more with what you're saying when you're a critical thinker and you ask questions early on, because I asked questions early on in my life. I was always asking questions, and and sometimes I would get answers, sometimes they were lies, you find out later in life. It's disappointing. And but I and I'll tell you what, I thought right up into probably 2018, I thought, not 2018, no, before that, maybe 2015. I thought I was awake, right? That I knew, like I thought I knew a lot, and I tried to discuss it. But I also had that moment where I stepped through the threshold, that veil of finding out this entire forest of things that have been hidden from us and going, I mean, I remember telling people, I thought I was awake. I thought I knew so much. And here to find out, there's like, I've been living in some other dimension that doesn't even matter. I mean, I was in La La Land, for goodness sake. But like, kind of literally, but finding out all of this information and doing that deep dive myself and going through, I, you know what I found comfort in, Michael? Knowing there was other people out there doing the same thing and trying to find them and connecting with them. And that gave me hope.
It's honestly, it's such a delight when that happens. If you've watched Tucker Carlson, and by the way, when I told the story about Amaryllis, uh, who worked for the CIA, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s uh, daughter-in-law, I might have said Amaryllis Kennedy. Her name's Amaryllis Fox. So correction. I apologize for that. No, if you've been watching Tucker Carlson, since he left Fox News and he has his own network, he's been doing fantastic interviews. He's he's a little crazy at times, but in a good way. I mean, he's just completely himself, and it's a delight to watch. And he said again and again that he lost a lot of people in his life when he started to go through this waking process, but then the people he's drawing in now, it's so much better. The conversations, the depth of the interactions, the getting to know people, having a shared mission with people who they're, he said that it's so much better. And that's one of the beautiful things about conferences. If you have an opportunity to go to these conferences where it's like-minded people, it's magical to be around people like that. I was at a Thanksgiving dinner I guess 4 years ago. And it was a group of people who all were just activists and they all found the truth in their own way. They all had their own story. And it was just such a nice group of people. I mean, getting because we connect on a different level. We don't have to have the small talk about the television shows and what's on TV and what movies are playing. We can talk about life and what's happening and what reality is. And
Yeah.
so that's really the thing I recommend the most is find the few people that you could talk with, find your group because it's so helpful.
Yeah.
Um, through COVID, we formed a group here in our community, and we were meeting regularly so that we could just talk about what was going on. And it was such a benefit to everybody. It was there was a strong bond that developed between all of us, and again, when you're operating in a world that seems a little insane at times, or people are believing things that just are not even remotely believable, to find those sane individuals in there, uh, it's huge.
Well, for me, I thought it was really cool to meet people. I went for my 65th birthday, I guess. I went down to Mexico and we were just doing a celebration of me, I guess. But I met people um, at it's not wasn't really a resort. It was an Airbnb, but like an apartment complex. But I met people there that were so on the same page, and it seemed like they're all from other places. They were from Spain. They were people that were Americans, but had been living in Mexico for a long time. And now I have a brand new friend that I met in Santa Fe, of all places, named Philippa, and she was a breath of fresh air too, coming from the UK. It's like, oh my gosh, it's like understanding that this isn't just a United States thing. This is a world thing. Everybody's watching. Everybody's, you know, watching what happens, especially in the US, because we matter. What happens here matters everywhere else. So, with that, I just think it was so cool to have a conversation with somebody that you could say something, even some of the most bizarre stuff, and they're like, "Yep, I know, yep, 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 yep." It's like, oh my gosh, really? I just like, your brain just wants to jump into theirs. It's like, let's mind meld.
Yeah, yeah. This whole program being forced on people. I mean, again, we'll get to this in our next talks, but there is an agenda at play, and it's called the Great Reset by the World Economic Forum, endorsed by Klaus Schwab. He said by 2030, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. They're talking about a complete transformation of society, principles of private ownership, how people will live, where people will live, the idea that people will be in 15-minute cities, that they'll be limited in their carbon use. I mean, basically, it's a whole big program, and it's happening gradually, a bit at a time. And at a certain point, it won't be so gradual anymore. They're going to use something big as cover. Basically, to reset a system, you kind of need to destroy the old system, and that gives you a clean slate on which to reset things. That's generally what reset means. And so it looks like they're going to find their ways to do something with the economy, do something with the electrical grid. A war would be cover for that. It doesn't mean that the enemy in the war actually did it. The enemy in the war might just be the cover, and then of course you could say, "Oh yeah, Russia did it." Right? Russia does everything. Right? Russia. All you have to say is Russia. People believe it.
Yeah, of course, except for the Russians and some of the other people in Europe. They're not buying it.
So with these kinds of agendas, this big agenda, it's playing out worldwide. The migration issues, massive migrations into countries, it's affecting many of the European countries.
is
And so I had these same types of conversations you and I would have. You could have those in Europe too. You have immigrants coming in, you have taxes and regulations going up, you have people experiencing less freedom in their country, less ability to have an influence on their own politicians. Their politicians appear to be taking orders from someone else, from some higher authority, not from the public. These countries are oftentimes intimidated by the UN or the WHO, large international bodies. And when they speak up about what's happening, they're called a racist or a bigot or a xenophobe or whatever else. And so then they're basically treated like a second class individual.
oh, definitely.
And this is happening all over, which so this waking process has happened again as the agenda pushes forward. It's waking people up, and you can have these conversations with people in any country.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that group of people, and and I find it kind of interesting that they're the biggest users. They've got all the jets. They fly around. In their private jets and their big yachts. They are the biggest users of carbon, shall we say? And but we are going to eat bugs because I don't want to go into that whole thing right now, but yeah,
Well, well, the short version on how much they're concerned about global warming. I mean, again, global warming is a story, and it's a way of, controlling energy, controlling resources, scaring people, keeping them in fear, making them question what kind of future they're going to have. So it's a great fear tactic.
they're creating the global.
But then they fly around in their private jets. And there was even in Europe, it was discussed whether or not there would be a tax on air travel because air travel is a big polluter and you use a lot of fuel. The one exemption that they were going to create was private flights. So private jets would be exempt from this taxation.
Of course, and they're going to also limit who can have them. I'm sure.
Yeah,
It's just us.
yeah.
Well, we've got a lot of other stuff to discuss, and I don't want to do it all in one fell swoop. So why don't we uh, table it for now and then come back, say next Friday? You want to try it again next Friday, and we'll pick it up and unless you have some more to share right now to kind of give us a short conclusion.
Let me end with one short example. The one of the stumbling blocks for people is when we talk about propaganda and media and everything, we think we don't have it in America. They had it in the Soviet Union. They had it in some of those other countries. They had it in Germany during World War II. Everybody knows the name Goebbels. So Goebbels, the propaganda minister in Germany. But we think we don't have propaganda here, and that's or you think that the propaganda is only on the other side. Fox News is propaganda, but Rachel Maddow is reliable. We kind of take this partisan attitude towards it. Yeah, exactly. If you track what she's saying and you look at all the examples, you realize that she's a CIA trained hack.
Yeah.
But that's the stumbling block for people. And so the interesting thing is, like John Pilger, a journalist, won a number of prizes. He was a war correspondent. He's a British, actually an Australian man living in London. And he once brought, after the fall of the wall and the Soviet Union fell and communism fell, he brought a group of communist journalists to America.
Yes.
And 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 they observed the media, and he said, you only hear two viewpoints here, and this is supposed to be such a free country. They couldn't wrap their mind around it. And Americans think they're free and that they don't have propaganda. And they basically said this is better propaganda than what we were under.
All right.
And so if we look at World War II, everybody knows Goebbels, but can you name the propaganda minister for the Soviet Union, Britain, or America?
Well, I can't.
Yeah. And that's the point. Not only do we not know who those people were, they do have names. Ilya Ehrenberg was a Soviet propaganda minister. Sefton Delmar was the British one, and Elmer Davis was the head of the Office of War Information in America. And he had about 45 people under him. It was a very big group. So we did have propaganda. But I would argue that the greatest success in Western propaganda is convincing the public that we don't have it.
Yeah.
We think the other guy always has it, and we think we are propaganda free. And when you look to another source, if you look to international news, and even international news is pretty heavily controlled, but if you look to, any of the Russian news outlets or something else, they're just dumbfounded that Americans believe everything that's in our media, and we don't realize that we too are subjected to propaganda.
Yeah.
Ideas like the Nord Stream pipeline, it makes sense that Russia blew up their own pipeline. It doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't even stand any test of scrutiny.
Well,
I think that'd be a good point to end on, is that just understanding that we're at where I would argue, based on observing information, watching a television segment, a news segment, and how many untruths there are just in a short period of time. I mean, like in 1 minute, there might be five lies. You almost have to pause the television, and if you're with your partner or your husband or somebody, and say, "Did you catch that? Did you catch that? Did you see what they did there?" You almost have to pause just to go over it because there's so much. So I would argue that Americans in the West are the most propagandized people in the world, more so even than.
That was a hard pill for me to swallow, but I swallowed it, and I realized that I'd been my illusions were shattered. It's like, oh no.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're so give us a little preview about what we're going to talk about next week. What do you think? Just some bullet points.
I think we should kind of touch on where things are going, this idea of the Great Reset agenda and where it's going. And then we back all the way up. And I would just go over some history and just give some historical examples of how things have happened, how power is operating. So I would say that in my study of propaganda, social engineering, I'm really interested in the powers and the elites and the people and how they operate and what their agendas are
Yeah,
because it is having an effect on us. Just like the interest rate affects people, all these other games, a lot of that's coming from them.
absolutely.
So I would say we would give a historical context, cover some specific events. And I'll always provide sources for any of these things so that people can go and look. So there on nearly every subject there is a whistleblower or a book or a series. There may be several documentaries on a particular subject and
Yeah,
we have so much more available now. Like we know the dispatches between ambassadors during wartime in World War II or something like that. We know what was said, and it again we call this revisionist history because we're able to revise our historical understanding because we have better information now. We know what was actually happening,
yeah, yeah, and it's
and,
gonna.
it's very different from the history books.
Well, yeah, because they always say history is written by the winner of the war, right? But people will be very surprised to find out who actually won which wars. So,
Right.
yeah. Well, with that, I want to say thank you so much for being here. And we had a good long conversation, probably longer than I thought we were going to go, but it's all been good. And
Okay.
we'll catch up again with you next week and we'll go down this rabbit hole a little further, huh?
Okay. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank
Hope your listeners enjoy it. I hope it's helpful to them.
you. Say that again.
I said, I hope your listeners, I hope some of this is helpful to them. We'll get into more specifics next time.
You know what? I find the tribes getting bigger and bigger all the time. So, all right. With that, I'm going to sign us out. Thanks for keeping it real with real people. And we'll see you next time. Bye
Thank
bye.